to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Hello and welcome to CSIS. My name is Joseph Majkut. I'm the director of our program in energy security and climate change. Very excited to start our conversation today with Mike Wirth, the chairman and CEO of the Chevron Corporation. Mr. Wirth has been the CEO since 2018. Before that, he held various leadership positions across much of the value chain for Chevron, midstream, downstream, development, chemicals. He began with the company in 1982 as an engineer, and he's a graduate of the University of Colorado. Mr. Wirth also serves on several boards and leadership councils for the industry, including the American Petroleum Institute, Business Roundtable, and the National Petroleum Council. Lastly, he's a board director for Catalyst, a nonprofit focused on building workplaces that work for women around the world. And I'm really excited to learn from him today about the state of the industry, his view on energy transition and energy security, and to glean from him lessons in leadership. Our conversation arrives at a very interesting moment. Post-Glasgow, the UN targets for climate change actually seem like they were in sight. IEA published that if every country were to meet its targets pledged at Glasgow, we would be looking at warming at the end of the century below 2 degrees centigrade, which is the first benchmark for success. But as we sit here today, energy prices have risen a lot globally, and that's causing political challenges and hurt here in the United States, but around the world is causing severe economic anxiety and real pain for people. And lastly, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which began about 100 days ago, has precipitated a realignment, not just in energy strategy in Europe, but perhaps in how countries around the world relate to each other. And energy is going to be part of that story. So hopefully we can cover all these issues today. But I know that you're here in Washington talking about energy transition and Chevron's plan. So maybe we can begin there. Mike, how does Chevron deliver more value with lower carbon?
Well, let me start. Thanks, Joseph. It's a real pleasure to be here. And let me start just with the concept of the energy transition, which oftentimes gets spoken about as if it's something new. When you've been in the energy business, and I have been, as you said, for 4 decades now, you learn that the energy system has always been in transition. And so if you go back to the beginning of the petroleum age, the middle of the 1800s, when the first commercial discoveries of oil were made, it wasn't used for cars or airplanes, which hadn't been invented yet. It was used for light. And it replaced whale oil, which was used in lamps. It was cleaner burning. It was more affordable. It was more readily available. And so it was a substitute. And by the way, it reduced the pressure on the hunting of whales. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I'll remind some of my friends in the environmental movement that actually our industry saved the whales back in the 1800s. But it met a need, and it met a need in a better way than the technology that had existed previously. You fast forward 50 years, and Henry Ford develops the Model T, the Wright brothers develop aircraft, and now it becomes part of the transportation system. And so as we roll forward from that, you can find points in time where our products changed power generation. So natural gas began to come into power to displace fuel oil, displace coal. So the energy system has always had 2 defining characteristics. One is it's ever larger. Population on the planet grows. Economic activity is underpinned by the consumption of energy to do work, to allow people to be more productive. And the mix has changed as society has looked to solve different problems. That's both problems of the utility of the energy, but also the environmental impact of the energy. So energy has always been in transition, and this concept of an energy transition is actually not something that's new. It's an extension of what we've always seen. One of the biggest challenges in it is that we have to solve problems at scale. And on a planet with 7.5 billion people, headed towards 9 billion by 2040, with a growing middle class, we have to recognize the integral role that energy plays in everything that underpins human activity, and the solutions that we look for to reduce the impact have to be scalable. And the last thing maybe in terms of just opening and framing is the discussion about energy is best when it reflects three realities. Energy needs to be affordable to change lives. It needs to be reliable in order to underpin the things that we rely on. And it needs to be ever cleaner. It needs to reduce the impact on the environment. And to have a good discussion about energy, we need to remember that all three of those matter. And I think events that you've referred to today have pointed out in Europe that reliable supply is something that we can't take for granted. We need to think about that. And as we see around the world, affordable energy really matters. And when energy prices rise, it hurts. And it hurts those at the lowest rungs of society first and most, most profoundly. And so we can't just seek ever cleaner energy. It has to be affordable. It has to be reliable. And it's the role of companies like ours to continue to advance that.
And surely public policy plays a role here, right? Because I take the point well. Energy has gone through many transitions. Some of them have been driven by technological change, the discovery of new natural resources. Some of them have been driven by political events. And this one is driven by, or the one that we are sort of presently in, is driven by technological change, political events, and a desire to respond to the risks of climate change, likely accelerating any transition that would have occurred from, say, the energy system that we had 20 years ago. So public policy plays a role. Something you said really touched a nerve for me, though, so I want to ask a follow-up in the context of affordability, reliability, and cleanliness. One thing I think often gets conflated in public commentary, in the view of politicians, in the view of the layman, is energy prices and the fact that some low-carbon technologies are more expensive. How do you think about building a world where the cost of energy is low, and yet let's say the price on carbon is relatively high or is escalating over time? And are those incompatible goals, or do you see them as relatively well aligned?
Well, the reason the existing system is in place today is because it's met society's needs in a way that's most cost effective. Society is always raising its expectations. Now, relative to greenhouse gas emissions, you can go back in time, it was with criteria pollutants that create air pollution, water pollution. If you go all the way back to the time when cars came into use, there was a concern about horse emissions and waste, right? Because horse-drawn transportation was the mode at the turn of the century, and horses have liquid, gaseous, and solid emissions issues that were creating health problems in New York and in London at the time. And so these things come in response to society. Policy responds to society, and we have to find a way to continue to make things affordable. Energy poverty continues to be a real challenge in the world today. There are billions of people that don't have access to the energy that in the developed world we take for granted.
That we regularly waste, probably.
That we regularly waste. And so we have to find a way to continue to make energy more readily available, affordable, and cleaner. There's a role for policy in doing that, but I think we also have to recognize that these other technologies, if they were truly more affordable, they wouldn't need a lot of policy encouragement, right? The markets are very powerful in terms of, when we've seen it with technology all around us today that has changed our lives. And so policy is helpful to create a foothold. Where you can run into problems is where governments and policymakers pick winners and losers, and they make big bets that the markets don't necessarily endorse as the winners. And so good policy, we believe would be performance-based, very transparent, economy-wide, as we look for ways to stimulate emission reductions and then allow different technologies to compete and find their niche. And one of the things in the Paris Agreement that's really, I think, a very elegant construct is it looks to each country to define their own pathway, because the state of development, the priorities of the country, the indigenous resources are different in sub-Saharan Africa than they are in developed Western Europe, than they are in China. And it's tempting sometimes for people in North America or Europe to believe that we have the answers for everyone on the planet, when in fact the people in different countries really are the ones that are charged with making those trade-offs. And so I think the Paris Agreement embodies that. There's still lots and lots of work to be done. There's lots of technologies to be developed. The IEA says half of the emissions that we need to get to those levels of outcomes have yet to be invented. And so we need to continue to support research and development, innovation, and ultimately harness the power of markets to mobilize the capital to make these changes at scale.
So I would like to talk a little bit about technology before returning to the overall picture. Your company is taking a really interesting strategy when it comes to innovation on low carbon technology. A lot of your peers have made big announcements about going into solar, we're going into wind, we're general energy services. My impression is Chevron's really focused on making molecules cleaner. Why is that the right move for Chevron? And what judgment sits behind that strategic approach to the challenge?
Yeah, so our core competency is managing molecules. Right, we get molecules out of the earth, we convert them into a more usable form, we get them to customers, and so we have deep competence in the technologies, the value chains, the relationships with equipment manufacturers and customers in that business. And some of the hardest to decarbonize sectors of the economy are users of those molecules: aviation, shipping, on-road transport. Manufacturing of things like cement and steel and fertilizer are big consumers of our products. In fact, only about a quarter of a barrel of oil goes into cars. 3/4 of a barrel of oil goes into all these other uses, and all natural gas goes into these other uses. Natural gas is not really used very much at all in transportation. And so we're working on the sectors of the economy that are the most difficult to decarbonize, that will rely heavily on technologies like renewable fuels, hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, and other technologies that we're investing in, where we have deep competence, where we've got assets, competence and capabilities, value chains, customers that we can leverage to help convert and solve problems for our customers in those sectors. Power, wind and solar is great technology, big fan of it. Not a deep competence of ours.
Right.
There's plenty of capital available. There are really good developers out there, and we don't add much to the equation. And so our choice has been to focus on the things where we can make a difference. And we're a consumer of wind and solar in many of our operations around the world, but we don't see a real role for us to play in developing that broadly because there's so many other good people already doing that.
Do you think that the policy environment or the business environment is more attuned to the challenges of what you call hard to decarbonize, or what some of my friends in the environmental community call must decarbonize sectors of the economy, now that net zero is sort of the target for greenhouse gas abatement?
Actually, no, I don't. I think a lot of the attention has been focused on the easy things. Renewable power, wind and solar are they're easy to identify. They're easy for people to understand. Grid scale battery storage is the next evolution of that, and those are they're all very important. But if that's all we do, we don't achieve the outcome that the Paris Agreement seeks, because we don't touch manufacturing, these other sectors of the economy that are so important, and where the majority of the emissions actually are incurred.
And if I may, if you kind of think about the overall decarbonization of the economy, it's a large construction project, so it's also going to rely on a lot of concrete, steel, and other manufacturing processes which are currently quite emissive.
That's right. They're very energy intensive, and those are the building blocks of modern society. They're the building blocks of wind turbines and solar panels, and so that's where we think we can uniquely help solve some of these most difficult problems. I don't know if you've seen Bill Gates' recent book on this subject, but it's a really great treatment of this, and talks about the green premium and asks the question, will you pay more for a green steel beam if you're building a skyscraper in China or India? Will you pay 6 times for a green steel beam as a conventional steel beam?
Right.
And of course, the answer in most instances is no, people can't afford to. And so we've got to get that green premium down, which is where technology and innovation are going to be so important.
So Chevron's made a recent investment in carbon capture and storage for a facility in California. And the CCS, kind of to use the abbreviation, has had a rocky road around the world, or a rocky history, excuse me, around the world. What do you see as the commercial case now? And how do we get that technology to scale so that it can be used in these hard to decarbonize arenas?
Yeah, technically, carbon capture and storage is feasible today. We're involved in two of the world's largest projects. In fact, we operate the largest on-purpose carbon capture and storage operation on the planet down in Australia. And it's a simple reverse engineering of what we've done for 150 years. Instead of taking molecules from within the Earth, moving them through infrastructure to customers, we're taking molecules out of the atmosphere and we're putting them back into a tight container inside the planet. And so we know how to do it. There's not a business model today for that. You've got, in some instances, it's been part of a project development that we've done where we've invested in these kinds of facilities. But without a market signal, it's difficult to mobilize the capital to do this at the scale that will really be necessary based on almost any of the independent modeling that's done to define the role for carbon capture and storage in the solution set. A price on carbon is the simple way to create a price signal that would create a business model that would mobilize capital. We have a price on carbon in Europe. We don't have one in the United States today. It's difficult politically, but we need to find some sort of a commercial framework, and it needs to be enabled by policy in order to incentivize the investment that will be required to bring that to scale. That, like I say, technically it's feasible, but to draw the capital to it, you've got to have a business model that works.
One of the other technologies that I think I hear a lot about in the context of industrial decarbonization, the must decarbonize sectors, is hydrogen. And when I read the newspaper, I see announcements from countries around the world. We want to be the leader in clean hydrogen production. And I know Chevron's got some ambitions in that regard too. But I struggle to think about what is the demand case here. How are we going to use clean hydrogen? I get that a lot of people want to make it. Countries are making big bets, and companies are making big bets to be leading producers. How do you see the sort of challenge of creating an ecosystem around this new energy carrier? And what do you think are the most viable prospects in the near term?
Yeah, so the first place where you can use it pretty easily is to co-fire it with natural gas in a combined cycle gas turbine generator to generate power. So gas has about 50% of the CO2 emissions of coal. You co-fire with hydrogen, you can bring those CO2 emissions down even further. Pretty doable within today's turbine technology. It can be used in steel and cement manufacturing in place of some of the fuels that are used for the high process heat that's needed in those applications. Ammonia can be used as a carrier for it to create marine fuels. We need to do work in all the prime movers to come up with engine designs that are optimized for hydrogen. So we've got a partnership with Caterpillar to work on locomotive designs and see if we can't help create engines that can haul trains that can run on hydrogen. We're working with the people that make big on-road transport. 18-wheelers are difficult to electrify because of the weight of the batteries and the range of the batteries. So there are a number of applications, but the key thing here on the demand side that you've touched on is we have to create entire new value chains and think about it not just from the standpoint of producing the molecules, but then how do they get consumed, and do the technologies exist today in order to create the customer demand? Right. And so we're working with Toyota on light-duty demand, OEMs on heavy-duty demand, rail, mining. So anything where you've got diesel fuel or marine fuels, potentially even aviation, where we can find ways to bring hydrogen into those uses.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen some really interesting policy constructs rising in Europe. I think the U.S. through the bipartisan infrastructure bill has this Hubs program, which is supposed to start matching suppliers and demand centers, and really allow the market to some extent to determine what's going to scale and what's going to actually be useful. I look forward to seeing that industry develop for the next decade or two.
Yeah, it's important. One of the things that will tend to have an influence that will govern the rate of penetration of some of these things is the capital replacement cycle on aircraft, ships, buildings, power plants tends to be multi-decades.
Yeah.
And so as we build these technologies, as we define some of the new consumer technologies, we then have to roll them in over kind of the natural replacement cycle on some of these large capital consuming assets around the world.
That raises a really interesting question that I'd like to close with. But before we do, I can't let you out of here without talking about the global energy situation. Very high prices around the world, creating challenging conditions for economic growth, for countries' energy security, paired with food insecurity from the Russia-Ukraine conflict. It could be a very bad year around the world. What can we do in the near term to make sure that we are guaranteeing adequate energy supply, both in developing and middle-income countries, but for the United States as well?
Yeah, the short answer is in the near term, markets are working hard right now. With the prices we see for oil, for natural gas, for refined products, the incentives are for producers to produce as much as they can. 2 years ago, we had the reverse situation where the incentives were to produce as little as you could. Prices were negative one day, they were very low, and production was constrained or shut in. And what's happened is we've seen demand rebound so strongly. In our industry, demand always moves faster than supply. We saw it on the downside in 2020, we're seeing it on the upside right now. And so the incentives are there for producers to produce. The best thing to do, and this is not always a very popular thing, is to allow markets to work.
Yep.
And so some of the policy proposals that you will hear to provide in California, where I live, gasoline cards, that encourages more consumption.
Right.
And the price signal in markets, a high price is a signal that says consume less, produce more. And if we have policies that disincentivize production and they incentivize consumption, what you do is you extend these situations. And there's an old axiom in our business that says the cure for high prices
is high prices.
Is high prices. The reason these sayings are around is because there's a kernel of truth to them, and it can be painful. It can be painful to consumers. It can be painful to our industry. High prices aren't good for us. They never last. What can last is bad policy that comes out of high prices. In the 70s, when we had the oil embargo, there were export bans put in place that were around for 40 years that disincentivized investment in production in this country. Finally, in 2015, under President Obama, those were removed, and that's one of the things that has stimulated the growth in this industry to now be the leading oil producer in the world. So markets can be very efficient. Policy tends to, even well-intentioned policy tends to have unintended consequences. And so encouraging supply, encouraging efficiency on the demand side, I think are the right things for us to do.
And as the market tightness that we're experiencing now was not created by the Russian-Ukraine conflict, but that really did precipitate changes in energy strategies around the world. As you think about both energy security and energy transition, what opportunities or risks are you starting to see arise out of the shifting stance of Europe toward Russian gas and the reverberations of European energy policy choices around the world?
Well, I think there's a bit of a paradox that I observe. On the one hand, you will hear from many of the Europeans, we need to go faster on renewables and reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, which is an extension of the strategy that they've been on already. On the other hand, that runs the risk of exacerbating the situation in the short term, which brings a lot of difficulties on consumers in those countries. And one of the things I worry the most about is a period of high prices that voters begin to identify with energy transition ambitions can undermine longer-term support for energy. In other words, people say, look, if this is what it's going to be, if we're going to have $5 gasoline prices, $6 diesel prices, $10 natural gas prices, and higher than that in Europe, I'm not sure I'm all for this transition, right? I mean, people are living their daily lives. They're not necessarily focused on, what the temperature is going to be decades out. And that can erode the public support that will be necessary for the energy transition. And so, on the one hand, doubling down on accelerating some of these technologies is what's being called for. On the other hand, that runs the risk of making things even worse in the short term from a pricing standpoint. It makes it difficult for companies like ours to invest in longer term supply with the questions about the longer term demand that raises. And we need to be sure that before we flip the switch to a new system and retire the old supply, that we really are prepared for that.
Yeah, I imagine you also have to think through, well, how do, if we're in a period of prolonged high prices, and let's talk about transportation for a moment. Like, EVs seem to be on the cusp where consumer preference is really starting to take off. How quickly can those supply chains be built? How quickly will consumers change? It must introduce a lot of uncertainty.
Well, the whole issue I talked earlier about scalability. I mean, EVs are just beginning to face some of the scaling challenges with the minerals required for the batteries. We haven't really seen battery disposal issues yet because we're early in the life cycle of these, but EV batteries don't last forever. EVs, electric vehicles at scale, will have huge solid waste disposal challenges with the batteries as they reach replacement stages. Charging infrastructure needs to be built out, and in this country we still have a long way to go on charging infrastructure. So scale requires infrastructure, and it requires new raw material supply chains. There are trade-offs on all these things. Nothing comes without some consequence, and we're just beginning to see that on EVs. And I think for the next decade, that'll be one of the big challenges in scaling up electric vehicles. Yeah,
my colleagues here and myself have done a lot of work trying to think through how do we build those supply chains in a way like, the energy security challenge is different because it's not fuel, it's stuff. But
minerals that come from a few countries in the world.
Yeah, and get processed in very unique facilities, and there's a lot of market concentration and a lot of challenges in that environment. Let me ask you to speculate as a final question.
Sure.
The last decade, we've had low interest rates around the world. And one thing that I really appreciate about energy companies is energy companies know how to make an investment in infrastructure. And a lot of the challenge is, for energy at the moment is turning over infrastructure, as you say. In a world where interest rates go up, does that put at risk either energy transition progress? Does it make it more expensive? Do we need to get more efficient? How do you think about the sort of energy transition challenge sitting in a broader macroeconomic picture?
Well, in the period we've been in where money is free, you can invest in a lot of things, whether or not they ever make sense. Future cash flows, as speculative as they may be, are discounted back at a very low discount rate. And so business models can spring up, companies can emerge that may really have risks that the market doesn't fully recognize because you don't have to discount the risk and because money is so plentiful. We're appear to be coming into a period of time where companies are going to need to earn a real profit, generate real cash. We have shareholders who expect a dividend. And so I think it brings some discipline back to investment. I think it can be good in that ideas, companies, technologies that can truly sustain an economic proposition are likely to separate from those that were highly speculative but perhaps not durable. And we can really start to see the market forces put capital behind the technologies and the business models that have the prospect to scale. And we're going to start to identify those that might have been interesting from an intellectual standpoint, but commercially maybe premature.
We are out of time, unfortunately. I could ask another dozen questions. So you're invited back to CSIS anytime. Mike Wirth, Chairman and CEO of Chevron. Any final words, sir?
Well, Joseph, we're big supporters of CSIS, have been for a long time, and appreciate the work you do well beyond just the energy topic. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'd love to come back.
Great. Well, until next time, friends joining virtually, until next time, we are signing off.